The Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by Pride Seeds, Cruiser Max Vibrance Beans, High Stick NT, and the Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Grower.
Joining us here on RealAgriculture.com for this edition or this episode of the Soybean School, we have Dennis Lange, a farm production advisor with Manitoba Agriculture, Food and Rural Development, based here in Altona, Manitoba. And Dennis, with growers looking to choose their soybean varieties for this upcoming growing season, I think it's a common question. How do I know if a particular variety is different from another variety in terms of yield?
Well, that's a question we get all the time when it comes to picking varieties and looking at single-year site data. It's important to note that these are statistically analyzed trials, and probably the best way to try to determine whether two varieties are different or not is to look at the bottom of the table and look for something that says LSD. And in the guide, we use LSD reported as a percent, but in other trials it can be listed as bushels per acre or pounds per acre. That LSD stays with that particular trial. So if the LSD in Carmen this year is 10%, you can compare any two varieties, and as long as if those two varieties differ by 10% or more, that means those two varieties are different. So they can be 10%, one variety can be 10% higher than the other one, or the other one could be 10% lower, depending on what you're using to compare it with. So what I've kind of come up with this year is something called the highlighter test. And basically it's a simple way for growers to kind of have a better understanding and maybe an easier way to pick a variety based on maturity and yield. And what you do is you get yourself 3 color highlighters and grab yourself a red or a pink one, and the first thing you need to do is you highlight the LSD in all the trials that you're looking at. So in Manitoba we have 4 core sites, and we have 3 short season sites and 2 long season sites. So highlight right across the row with that particular LSD. And for example, if we look at the Carmen site, the Carmen LSD this year, the significant difference is 10%. Then you take that pink highlighter again and you highlight your check variety, and in this case it's 00421. That would be your 100%, so everything's compared to that. So for example, if a variety then is 10% or greater, you take your green highlighter and you highlight anything that's 10% or greater in green, and you go right down the list, because then you have 75 lines to choose from, and if you do that for every single line, that will show you which varieties are greater than the check. Do the same thing with your orange highlighter, but now anything that is 10% less than the check you highlight in orange. So if a variety is 90% or 89%, you highlight those in orange. When you're done the columns, what you'll find is you'll have a combination of green and orange, and then you'll have some that aren't highlighted at all. And those values are also important because number one, the maturity is listed as the shortest maturing varieties near the top of the page and longer season varieties at the bottom. And what you'll find is that if you look at the different groupings, you'll find in the short season ones, you'll probably have a number of lines that will be equal to the check or less than the check, but you might have a few that are greater than the check. And as you go down the table, what you'll find is as varieties get longer, then you'll probably see more varieties out yielding the check, just because if longer season varieties, typically we use a mid-season line for a check. If you're using longer season lines, typically those longer season lines will be higher yielding than the mid-season varieties, but you also have to have the full season in order to get those higher yields.
This will also give you a visual of instances where a longer season variety might be too long for particularly on the western side, and as you move further north in Manitoba and into Saskatchewan.
Well, exactly. If you actually did this test with the western trial and you highlighted the 4 locations there, what you'll find is one of the locations, Roblin, actually had a little shorter growing season, not as much heat this year. And what you'll find at that particular site by using this highlighter test is you'll find a lot of the values are orange, closer to the bottom of the table, meaning that some of these varieties are a little longer, and in that particular region they didn't have a full growing season. So that tells you that sometimes if you don't have a full growing season, you don't get to maximize your yield. The one thing you have to be careful with when you're using this highlighter test is keep in mind this is one site or one growing season. You have to use the variety description table, which is the table that will list not only the yield as percent check, but how many site years. The greater the number of site years you have, the more confident that you are with the percent yield of check is representative of the variety. So for example, if you have 7 site years of a variety, that typically would tell me that that variety has been tested over 7 different locations, but generally we have anywhere from 6 to 7 per growing season, so that would mean 1 growing season. Whereas a variety that had 33 site years, that means you would have multiple growing seasons, but you have 33 different locations where it was tested. So that value, the percent yield as check, that will give you a better representation on how that does over more site years.
Okay. How about some of the other categories? IDC rating, is that something that growers should be paying close attention to?
Well, in that variety description table, you will have IDC ratings as well. And the IDC ratings is divided up into two columns. The test itself is done at a site close to Winnipeg. The varieties are tested replicated 3 times, and we go out, or I go out actually 3 different times over a 3-week period, and I rate each variety. So you have a grouping, IDC grouping, and an IDC score. The lower the number, the more tolerant it is to IDC, iron chlorosis. The grouping will kind of bring that other number and tell you what group it's in. For example, if you have a variety that is a 1.6, that would be considered tolerant. Okay, the grouping would be tolerant. Whereas if you have a variety that's 2.3, it could be either semi-tolerant or it could be susceptible. And it's just kind of on the edge. And the reason for that is because we're going out, multiple times. When we're giving that grouping kind of indicates to you if it's rated on the lower end, that means it's probably a little bit more susceptible in that case than it would be semi-tolerant. So that's another good category to use. There's also other information in there as well. Again, all the varieties are also listed in that table from earliest maturing at the top of the page to longer season varieties as you go down the list. And that's just an easy way for growers to kind of help pick your varieties.
And this year, because of some changes to the registration system, there's also experimental lines included in the Seed Manitoba Guide?
Exactly. In the there's a separate section, a colored section, that will list the experimental lines that have been tested in Manitoba. Those are lines that have either A, been supported for registration in the past, or and will include other varieties only being tested and have not been supported. And that, because that system's changed a little bit now, we've changed the category a little bit. So they're it'll give growers a chance to look at some of the new lines coming out that haven't been registered yet and see how they perform.
Okay. Finally, can I put you on the spot and ask you what you're hearing from growers, what they're expecting? Or
1.5 million acres.
1.5,
there's my number for
Manitoba. You heard
Manitoba.
it from Dennis Lange.
That's my number for this year.
All right. Thank you, Dennis.
Thanks.